Welcome back to the Saints and Alumni Show right here on WBCR 88.3 The Saint. I'm your host this week, Brandon Murphy, class of 2017 from the Office of Alumni Engagement. And this week I am joined by Jean Reamer Keam, class of 1976. And we're actually joined today by Jean all the way from Australia as we celebrate 50 years of Siena women's basketball. Today we'll talk about her Siena experience and being a founding member and player of the program as we look back on 50 years. A reminder to everyone listening today that there are a few ways to listen to the Saints and Alumni Show. You can listen here on WBCR 88.3 The Saint, Apple and Spotify podcast, iHeartRadio, and then subscribe to the Siena Alumni YouTube channel to watch the complete selection of shows. Jean, I want to thank you for taking the time to sit down with the Siena community today to help share the story of how Siena women's basketball all started some 50 years ago. So officially, it's your first time on the show. Welcome. How are you doing today?
Great, Brandon. And thank you so much. It's a pleasure to speak with you today about the start of the women's program. And I'd like to thank Siena for setting up the 50-year anniversary celebration. I think that's wonderful that they are recognizing that milestone achievement.
And the college has been planning the event for the past few months. The event is on Saturday, January 20th, where we'll be celebrating 50 years when Siena women's basketball plays the Iona Gals at 2 p.m. But before we get to the celebration and even the start of Siena basketball, we want to get to how your story ended up here at Siena. It's always tradition when we have the guest on the show to kind of hear about how you ended up at Siena. So, Jean, can you first share with the audience today kind of where you grew up and kind of how you learned about Siena College?
Sure. I grew up in New Jersey, and some 50 plus years ago, when I was considering where to go to college, my family used to vacation up at Trout Lake and Bolton Landing, which is near Lake George. And my dad loved to wander, so we'd always take back roads. And back then, of course, the Northway was fairly new. And we'd take Route 9 and go right past Siena College. So I'd say the beauty of Siena Hall is what captured me to even think about Siena. So I always used to say I'm going to consider that college when my time comes. Here I am, 8, 9, 10 years old. And at the time, my mother had a second cousin who was a Franciscan friar, so that my parents were very open to the idea of me going to Franciscan college. What sold me on the Siena was my campus tour. When I went on the campus tour, it was, a gorgeous spring day. We all know what those were like, and still are. My tour guide was Rudy. He was the friendliest, most outgoing fella, and he'd walk across the campus and he'd be saying hi to everybody. They'd be saying hi to him. It just had a great vibe, the entire campus. And it had recently gone co-ed, which didn't bother me. I got 5 brothers. So my two sisters both went to all girls school. So I guess I was a bit of a renegade, but that's really how it all started for me.
And my twin Andy and my best friend Anto, they both work in admissions. They love hearing that type of stuff from prospective families. And everybody in the Siena community loves hearing about how beautiful that college campus is here at Siena. And it's hard for me to believe that we've been doing the show for 2 years now. And honestly, we haven't had many guests that either attended Siena or worked at Siena in the 70s. And we always like to have our guests that come on kind of paint a picture of what Siena looked like back at that time that they attended or worked at Siena. So, Jean, can you give our listeners today a little bit of insight on that campus layout that was so beautiful when you attended Siena?
Oh, certainly. I'll try to do it. It was very different, so I'll try to make it quick if I can without getting too much detail. But of course, Siena Hall was the centerpiece, the welcoming building, and it still is today, that beautiful building. Just walking quickly clockwise around the back of the quad, you had Gibbons Hall. Now that's now called Foy and is the theater, but back then that was the basketball gym for the men, and then we'll talk about it, but also for the women. And then you had Roger Bacon, and that was there, but it wasn't expanded or at that point in time. Oh, and I must admit, I was remiss. Gibbons Hall also downstairs was a Rathskeller. When I went to college, we were still able to, the drinking age was 18. So the Rathskeller was a hot spot for Fridays, Saturdays, evenings, if you will. Then you go further across the campus, behind the original, just a little fun story. Behind Roger Bacon was a parking lot, not nearly as big as it is today. And at the end, it actually dropped off. And that's where I learned how to ride a motorcycle. but I'd say I didn't really learn because as I went off the end and did recover and come back off, I said, that's it. I just think I'll pass on learning how to ride a motorcycle. But that parking lot was a lot smaller. Then in front of Roger Bacon was actually a field that, like I remember the guys played lacrosse. I think we had club lacrosse at the time. Moving across, the cafe was still there, but it was smaller. It's since been expanded. And then the student union was our library. And then the back half of the campus, you had the baseball field, very simple baseball field. You had benches, you didn't have dugouts and stands and what have you. The Arc itself, that didn't open until 1975. So to the left, behind the baseball field, we had a small in-ground outdoor swimming pool, a couple of tennis courts. Then moving across the other side of the campus, you had the dorms. There were only 3 dorms on campus, no townhomes, no extra dorms. Paddle Hall was the friary. That's how many friars we had. We needed a dorm that, big for the friars. The dorms were only 4 stories. We didn't have any additions put on the top. And my freshman year, there was just 3 floors. I think it was only 3. I don't think that was, I know it wasn't any more than that. It was definitely 3, maybe 2 floors of women in Hennepin Hall. The 4th floor was men. But by my second semester, senior year, we were busting at the seams, and they asked people to move off to the lakeside apartments. So anyway, that was the campus, much smaller than it is today, but still equally as beautiful. The one main difference that we noticed coming back is when we were there, the trees in the quad behind Siena Hall had just been planted, and wow, what a difference 50 years makes to a tree. So it's still a beautiful campus, but much smaller.
I always tell family members, prospective families that we engage with at events, Siena is really like this beautiful state park that you get to walk in every single day as a Siena student. And of course, the component with that as you're walking across campus are those academic buildings and getting that academic education. And Siena really provides that top tier education as a Franciscan institution, and then with that liberal arts education as well. Just some quick tidbits to note, top 10 best Catholic college, #1 for getting a job in New York State for 3 straight years. And it's really impressive to see the growth with the beauty, the academics, and the athletics that we'll get to in the second segment. But for you, Jean, can you talk a little bit about your academic experience, the skills that you gained with that, and then what happened after you graduated from Siena?
Sure. Happy to. As you mentioned earlier, I was an accounting major, and that really did shape my career. Because my first job out of Siena was working with Western Union as an operational internal auditor. And of course, my accounting degree got me that job. Back then, it was, for me, a 4-day work week, which was pretty advanced for Western Union. And I traveled 80% of the time because, again, at the time, Western Union had area offices, 13 area offices, and a lot of small offices. So we were constantly traveling to do our audits. It proved to be a great company to work for. Again, ahead of their time, they had a very good internal recruitment department. So I ended up leveraging that accounting degree. I moved into corporate accounting. Then I attained my CPA, and that actually got me my job in, of all things, data processing is what it was called back then, quality assurance. Because Dave that hired me, he said, if I could get my CPA, I could probably handle the quality assurance job, because I had no background in it. But then again, not too many people did, because IT, as we call it now, was very new. So the rest of my career ended up in IT because Western Union outsourced their IT department to EDS, and I was able to continue to change and do different things within EDS. That was the nature of that company also. And I did account management and sales support. So that accounting degree continued to support me because you always had budgets and things to balance and what have you. So it was great. And then the other thing EDS did for me is it took me to Melbourne, Australia, which is where I am now. And it's where I met my wonderful husband. So it was all good. Accounting degree was great.
And I love hearing this, it's not specifically the Siena sweetheart story, but there's still that Siena connection and taking that education with you abroad and finding the husband too, which is always great to hear when we have guests on the show. And we have just about 5 minutes left in the first segment today. And we have 2 questions left that are going to help paint a picture for what we get into with the second segment in 50 years of Siena basketball. And that first one is those outside the classroom experiences that are so important here at Siena. And one of the things that you were involved with at Siena was the Women's Athletic Association as the intramural director. Can you talk a little bit about that role and the responsibilities you had with that?
Sure. Brandon, that role was really to promote women's sports and athletics at Siena. And of course, it was the first time we had it because Siena was co-ed until began co-ed at 1969. It was all male until 1969. So it was important to have a program that enabled the women to get engaged and involved in athletics. Once the arc was open and built, we had more room, but in the beginning it was small. We had Gibbons Hall to compete with the guys and to use or what have you, but we did it, and we had a great time. My responsibilities, if that's what you're thinking about, was things like marketing the programs and getting people to sign up. And then once we had the programs going, it was rostering the games, arranging for any refs we might need, and that was always just other students, be it male or female, ordering whatever we needed as far as equipment and t-shirts. And then we had an awards night. So I would work with the other members of the Women's Athletic Association to take care of the awards night, and that was always a fun night to recognize the women. So that was essentially it. It was, and I worked with a group of lovely women, making it all happen. It was good fun back then. We just did it because we were passionate about it and we enjoyed it.
And we have just about 2.5 minutes now left until we have to conclude the first segment. And to start something, you always have to be passionate about it and have an interest in that. And I want our listeners to kind of start to learn and hear how you loved basketball and what made you passionate about spearheading the initiative to start a women's program here at Siena.
Really, it was just my love of the game. I really enjoyed the game as a child. I was one of 8. We always had a basketball court in the backyard. So I just loved basketball. So that was easy from that perspective. I played it in those days. First time I played, there were 6 women or girls, I should say, on the court, and it evolved from there. But being a part of the team attracted me to the basketball. When I arrived at Siena, the classes of 74 and 75, they had started playing other colleges in the area, a little bit more than pickup basketball, but they had gotten it all going. It was fantastic. And it was just a great group of women who inspired me and many of the others to keep the momentum going so that we would be able to build that women's basketball program.
Don't go anywhere. When we come back and start the second segment, we're going to dive into kind of that original team, those early years of Siena women's basketball, and the event celebrating 50 years of basketball here at Siena. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back here on WBCR 88.3 The Saint. Welcome back to the Saints and Alumni Show right here on WBCR 88.3 The Saint. I'm your host this week, Brandon Murphy, class of 2017 from the Office of Alumni Engagement. And this week I'm joined by Jean, Reamer, Keam from the class of 1976. We're actually joined by Jean all the way from Australia as we celebrate 50 years of Siena women's basketball. We just concluded talking about the parts of your Siena experience, but we kind of left out maybe the biggest part of that experience, and that being women's basketball. And that's really what we want to focus segment 2 on today. So Jean, can you give our listeners a little bit of insight on when the first team at Siena began and how in those early years kind of we put a team together at Siena?
Sure. I graduated in 76, but it was the classes of 74 and 75 that organized things and got them started. And they just did it themselves. There were no tryouts, word of mouth. The girls picked up the phone and called the different schools in the area to arrange for games to be played. They paid for their own uniforms. They took care of their own transportation to get to and from any games. Of course, it was all local. The practice time in the gym, that was difficult. It was just Gibbons Hall, and the men's obviously took priority. So the girls got, as I recall, like 2 nights a week for 2 hours to play. And there was no budget per se allocated for the women's basketball. It was early days. But just to give you a bit of context, what was happening back then, 1969 was when Siena went co-ed. The first women on campus were in the fall of 1970. So these girls were the first 2 classes to graduate off the campus. Title IX was signed in June of 1972, and that said you cannot discriminate against women in education, which included the sports area. So it required comparable facilities and programs by 1977. So that's the context of where things were evolving to. So it was the first 3 classes, including my own class, that nudged Siena to ramp up the programs and accommodate women in various women's sports, not just the basketball. Matter of fact, there was a student representative who was also on the Women's Athletic Association that was on the athletic board back then. And she really did push to make sure that the program was recognizing the women as well as some of the men's sports, because basketball was, it wasn't unique to Siena, but Title IX, basketball, the whole thing was premier, if you will, at the time. So I'd say by my junior year, the school was paying for the basketball coach rather than just having a student do it for us. And that's when we were named to the NCAA program. We had a 10-4 record our first year, which I thought was pretty good.
Yeah.
We were just a small college, just recently co-ed, forming that team. And there were no scholarships, certainly no full scholarships. There wasn't a basketball organization behind the women that was marketing or recruiting, or there weren't assistant coaches. It was just the love of basketball that got the program going. And I do want to emphasize that while it was difficult at times and we were pushing and nudging the school to make things happen, it was not unique to Siena. It was happening all over. But Siena probably had the biggest awakening because they had just gone co-ed, and then all of a sudden these women want all these things. But it was good. It was all good.
And when we look at a grassroots effort like this, there's probably some pretty amazing stories that were created and memories that you now look back on with some of your closest classmates and teammates as well. I kind of look at this as, there's a brand new band. They're trying to make their way, make a footprint, and they're doing all this outreach together. They're traveling together and making history. Can you kind of share some stories that you look back on that you smile at during these early years of Siena basketball that you really enjoy?
Well, one thing I'll say, Brandon, is we weren't doing this and thinking, wow, we're making history. We were just having a good time. We were doing what we loved. We were passionate about basketball and just really enjoyed it. So we would back then we did come back early on Christmas break so we could do a little bit of practice. So we weren't just a bunch of hooligans. And that was great. We enjoyed all that. We could barely walk after 2 days because sitting home and then coming back and all of a sudden running the gym. But it gave us time to get into the gym too, because when there's no one else on campus but the sporting teams, it makes it easier. But a couple little tidbits I remember is I think it was St. Rose or maybe Russell Sage. Their gym was so small that in order to be out, you had to put your foot on the wall, and that signaled to the ref that you were out and you were passing the ball in. As I mentioned earlier, we would drive ourselves to the games. One little story I remember, unfortunately, was coming back from the Hudson Valley Community College game. It was a snowy evening, and so getting out of the parking lot, the coach had been driving. He drove to a lot of the games, and a few of us were in the car, and he had it in second gear. And then he gets out on the north wind. He forgets to take it out of second gear. Oops. So he had a little transmission issue to take care of when he got back. But anyway, as I mentioned earlier, our first year we were 10-4, but there were years where there was a lot more losses than before. But we had a great start. We were a young program, and so I think there wasn't maybe as much pressure as there is on the program today to perform. We were able to get things going and have a good time.
And you talk about, a lot of pressure on athletes currently at the Division I level, even at Division II and Division III. And our listeners might be curious today, kind of what was that demand on a student athlete back in the 1970s? So, Gene, can you give us a little bit of insight on how it was from the 70s compared to what the demand is nowadays for student athletes here at a Division I level?
I can tell you my experience and that of the other women on the basketball team back in the 70s, and I'm sure it was significantly different. First of all, I'm sure we didn't think of ourselves as student athletes. We just were students who loved to play basketball. And yes, there were demands on our time to attend practice and to be disciplined and what have you, but there weren't as many games. There was no overnight travel. Games were all local. There was no TV coverage. And we weren't recruited to play basketball. We were there to be students and we happened to love to play basketball. So did we have some things in common with the girls today? I would say yes. Learning how to work as a team and bonds that form when you do that well. We all had a common goal and we had respect for each other. We created lifelong friendships, and I hope that's still happening today. We needed to have discipline in order to excel. And certainly that's a good thing. And that creates good habits, creates resilience, perseverance, time management. I do recall my best semester was junior year when I was working hard with the Women's Athletic Association, doing the basketball. I mean, the more things I had to do and the more I had to manage my time, the better I would be. And we definitely had a desire for education. And I'm sure the women today do too, because it's the education, as we talked earlier, that provides the launch pad for a successful career.
And we have just under 5 minutes left now in today's show. And we have two final questions to get to, kind of looking back on what we're proud of here in this journey, and then some advice to those that are listening and to the current team. And through 50 years of basketball, there have been incredible progress along the way through Siena initiatives and through Title IX. And recently, specifically with Siena Athletics, we have started the initiatives of Building Better Saints. We've completed the Bob Guido 68 Athletic Academic Center and the new Siena Fueling Station, thanks to the generous support of lead donors Frank 1985 and Sheila Ambrose, as well as many other supporters across the Siena community to help build Better Saints and the student athlete experience. But for you, Gene, specifically, and with your team at that time, what are you most proud of from being there from the beginning and as a leader from the beginning, as you look back on 50 years of Siena basketball?
I think I'd have to say it was teamwork and commitment. And that occurred across several classes of women that launched not just the women's basketball program, but Siena Women's Athletics. It was really a humble beginning for the first few classes of women who attended Siena. Everyone had to adapt to now a co-ed school and also to Title IX. So we didn't just play sports, we helped launch them. And again, I said it earlier, we didn't really think about the history we were creating, but we just did what we enjoyed. And so we worked together well as a team, and we were committed to making the program work, not just for ourselves, but for the women that did come after us. So that was fantastic. And I have to say, in preparing for today's session, I just went out and checked, and I found it fascinating that there are now 11 women's varsity sports at Siena. And I think that's just wonderful. I think congratulations to Siena College that in the 50 years that they've developed such wonderful programs for the women.
And it's great to continue to see those women's programs compete competitively and win championships within the MAC, and which is our athletic conference at the Division I level. And we're going to celebrate many of those accomplishments, many of the players through the years of Siena basketball on January 20th at the annual Women's Alumni Day, as we celebrate those 50 years. Women alumni and family can attend for free and can register at siena.edu/alumni/events. The day will be filled with players sharing memories and watching the current team compete, and it will conclude with a post-game reception where alumni can interact and network and build relationships with the current team. And Gene, you're going to be in Australia at that time, so you won't get a chance to network and build a relationship with the current team this year, but maybe you'll be watching the game on ESPN Plus, and we hope to have you back on campus soon. But for any of those players that will be listening to the podcast, or maybe any students that are female that are looking to pursue building a program, kind of what would be some final advice that you would give to those listening today?
Try to keep it simple and just don't lose sight of the importance of the teamwork in sports and carry that through in life. I think it's just a great grounding, if you will, to be able to be a part of a team and to build relationships and to work together. And so that will carry you past sports and into life and into your career. And I guess I'd also just say, believe in yourself. Don't be afraid to step out of your comfort zone. Just do it. Just get out there and make it all happen. And hopefully find something that you're as passionate about as basketball as you move into your career.
Gene, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with the Siena community today, to share your Siena story and to share the story about Siena women's basketball. We hope to have you back on campus soon, and we hope to have you on the show again as we celebrate another 50 years of Siena women's basketball. Thank you, everyone, for listening today. We'll see you next time right here on the Saints and Alumni Show. Have a great weekend.